Alright, we're going to look at how to delid a 10900K CPU using the Rocket delid kit. So when you first get started, you'll notice that the delid bracket, the base that you put it in, has a triangle for pin 1. You'll notice you have triangle here on the CPU for pin 1. So you want to set that in the base that way. Make sure that the plunger is pushed back all the way. That pushes the IHS off the die. And assemble the two halves with the Allen head screws and the smaller Allen wrench provided in the kit. They don't need to be super tight, but you don't want the two halves of the Delid tool sliding against each other. So using the larger Allen wrench, you want to tighten down that plunger. And you begin tightening it until it pushes the CPU off the die. It'll have some resistance. You'll be able to tell whenever it comes loose. And it got easy at that point. And I can see that the lettering's in a different spot in there, and this screw is moving in that opening, so we know it's loose. And you can see that it slid completely off. Look there. So at this point, what we're going to do is use Quicksilver to remove all the original indium solder from both surfaces. There can be no traces of the indium solder left on either surface because that will cause contact interference and could potentially fracture the die if there's a spot where it puts excessive pressure. We're also going to remove all traces of this original black rubberized sealant so that the PCB is squeaky clean. You can use the bamboo pick tool to remove the rubberized sealant that's on there. You can also use your fingernail. That works really well. The important thing is you got to get all of it off. So you can see right there it's got most of it off. There's still a slight residue. We can clean that off with some acetone. One thing you'll want to bear in mind when you go to put this back together is look at the way the alignment is. You want to put the IHS, if you're using the stock IHS, you want to put it back on in the same orientation. You don't want it this way or flipped 180 degrees or 90 degrees. So the original rubberized seal has a little airspace right there. And if you look here, there's also, here's pin 1 with the this edge is flat right here. The rest of them are round. So when you put it back together, it needs to go back that way. If you're using a Rocket IHS, copper IHS, there's a little hole that corresponds with pin 1. So we'll set that aside for you. So we'll continue cleaning this off. So as you can see now, I've got the majority of it off. I'm going to remove the rest of it with some acetone. Easiest way to get that is some nail polish remover, which is acetone. It'll tell you right on the back of the label what the ingredients are. You can also use like a pink eraser like you'd use for a pencil to go over this if you're having any trouble getting it off. Sometimes it's more difficult to get it off of the IHS than it is the silicone. Just using this bamboo pick to knock off the little pieces. The majority of it came off with my fingernail on the acetone. But you don't want any traces of that rubberized crap left on there, because it'll cause problems with the IHS laying down flat. Also, if you're going with the bare die situation, as I'm doing on my desktop, any kind of foreign material that you have on top of here, that rubberized material, will cause a problem when you put the bare die bracket over the top of it. It'll tilt the CPU, compress it harder down in the pins on one side than the other. So you really want it spotless before you put it together. And as you can see, that really didn't require a lot of effort. It's pretty simple. Different matter here, often a little bit more difficult to clean this off. I'm going to go ahead and do that now, even though I'm going to go back with bare die. I want to have this available for another time, perhaps. So I'm going to use one of these Scotch-Brite pads, like what comes with liquid metal, and use that around the edge of it to get the last bit of that rubber off. You can see that did a nice job. There's still just a little bit right in this area here. It's really not going to hurt anything, but I'd prefer not to have any of it left. So it's looking pretty nice. So you can still see I've still got a little bit of this rubber crap left on here. So I'm going to get the rest of that off. Sometimes it's really hard to see unless you hold it at the right angle in the light. You do not want to use this on the CPU. If I hold the CPU at the right angle to the light, I can get a glare off the PCB and spot the little flecks of the black rubber that's still left. believe that's got it. I'm using a plastic table here, and you can see that the acetone put a shiny spot on it, which that's why I bought this table for working, so it's not going to matter much. I'll go over that one more time, get any of the residual rubber fragments off of it. Alright, so the next steps, we're going to use Quicksilver, which you can also get from Rocket Cool, and apply it to the indium solder to dissolve it. Once we've got all that off, we're going to take some clear nail polish and put it on these dots here to prevent any short circuit if any liquid metal gets over there on that. This packet was leaking when it was sent to me, and the folks at Rocket Cool were really good about sending me another one. This is still going to work. Dull scissors. Time to get some new scissors, guys. Looks like the plastic cap got broken. I'll set this off to the side, and I'm going to see if I can recover some of that that's spilled in there for another Delid. So this bag is going to have a couple of swabs that you can use to scrub that, and comes with some Flitz polish too that you can use to clean it up. Now, I want to emphasize here, this stuff it doesn't take a lot of effort to get it off, but it does take patience. You need to let this stuff sit on here and dissolve. It may take more than one application. You may have to scrub it around quite a few times and let it sit and just wait. It will dissolve the indium. Don't get in a hurry. Don't try to scrape it off with the razor blade or anything like that. Just let it do its job. It may take, 15-20 minutes. It may take a half an hour. I've done several CPUs. Some of them it comes off easier than others, but the important thing is it will come off. Just be patient. So I'm going to set that aside. Now, one thing I don't know if you noticed, you may have pieces of this flake off while you're dissolving it, so you don't want to do this right over your computer, because you don't want any chunks of this dissolved solder flaking off and landing on something that's going to cause a short. So once you've got most of it dissolved, you'll probably need to clean it off so you can see what's left. So I'm going to use another cotton swab here. You can see that there's still actually a thin layer of solder that's on here that has to come off. It's dissolved most of the bulk of it, but you cannot have any of that left on the die or the IHS, or it'll cause contact problems, and overheating may fracture the die if it puts pressure in one spot. You'll be able to tell whenever it's just, when there's nothing left but the actual die, because it'll have a dull, won't have a chrome look to it like this is right here. It'll have a very dull finish, and you'll have to use the flitz polish to get it to shine up. So I've got so much quicksilver on there now, it's hard to see how much, if all the solder is dissolved or not. So I'm going to clean a lot of that off and see what we have left. You can scrape it off, but use something that is not going to gouge the metal or the silicone die. You know, plastic edge, your fingernail, even something like this bamboo pick can be used to dislodge any stubborn pieces of solder. But if you're patient and let it do its own thing and dissolve it, you really won't have to do much of that. And it's starting to turn into a real sludge now, but I can still feel as I rub across it that there's chunks of solder that are still not completely dissolved. So I'm going to let this set some more. I'm going to come back over here, see how this is doing. Oh yeah, that feels a lot better. After we got all the extra material off of there, that let that quicksilver attack that thin layer of solder that was being stubborn. And I believe it's probably all dissolved now. It certainly feels smooth as I rub across it. So let's clean that off and see what it looks like. And now I can see that there's still a few more flecks of solder that I need to get off, but those will be easily removed. So now we're going to use some flitz polish. I'm going to get a clean piece of paper towel, put a little bit more flitz polish on there. You want the die to look like chrome. It'll be a highly polished surface. take that back. There's a little bit right here. You can see it if the light's right here and right here. We have to get that off. Can't leave that on there. Okay, that's gone. And that's gone. So let's use a little bit more flitz. We're almost there. On the home stretch. For the final clean up, I'm going to use some of these alcohol prep pads like you use for for cleaning the site before you give an injection. You can get those at your local drugstore like Walgreens or Rite Aid. Now, with this completely clean, I can still see a slight residue. Looks like it may still have a little bit of solder left on it that a little bit more polishing with flitz is going to remove. There's a slight haze that I can see right in this area and a tiny bit on this corner. Yep, that did it. So the CPU is ready to go. So going to need to make sure we don't have any quicksilver or solder residue left on anything. So I'm going to take the CPU out of this real quick. Give a quick once over along the edge and on the contacts with this alcohol prep pad to make sure that there's no residue from the quicksilver or solder. I'll do the same thing here on the Delid tool. Pin 1. Now we're ready to put some clear nail polish on these contacts here. These do not need it because they're outside of the IHS. This does not need it because it's I'm not sure what that is, but it doesn't need it. You need it right here on these. Seeing a little reflection of something that looks like solder right there, but it's not on top, so it's not hurting anything. I'm going to give it one more quick over with some flitz. Some clear nail polish. We'll let that dry. I'll set this aside so I can finish the IHS. There you go. That CPU is ready to put back together. You can still see the lettering on it nicely. We have our clear nail polish dry, and now we need to clean up the mess. Alright, now I'm going to put this Rocket copper IHS on. The first thing we're going to want to do is put this template over the top. That'll show us where to guide it in place. Again, you're going to have the gold triangle for pin 1 lined up with pin 1 in the socket of this Delid tool. I'm going to leave these two screws loose and tighten this one down on this side here. This will just hold it, these two here, because we're going to put an arm on top of it in a few minutes, using those two screws to clamp down the IHS. So what I've done here is I've got just a little bit of black RTV silicone that I'm going to apply with the spatula on the edge of the IHS, but first we'll have to apply our liquid metal. So you need to use some rubbing alcohol or some acetone, or both. I like using acetone followed by rubbing alcohol, which I've already used acetone on it. So I'm going to clean that off with the alcohol prep pad, both surfaces, so that there's no oils or contaminants on it. And we're going to put Cool Laboratory Liquid Pro on here. I buy these off of Amazon. They're like lip gloss applicators. They work really well for applying liquid metal. And put a little bit there, and a little bit there. That's about all you need. The surface needs to be coated, and it needs to come together wet. So the surface is completely coated. There's no puddles or runoff. You can tilt it, it's not moving anywhere. And so again, we want to line up pin 1, which is right here, the dot, the pin 1 here. So our orientation is going to be lengthwise this way. These two notches right here are also an indication they go down on this end where pin 1 is. The two halves have to come together wet. You cannot use liquid metal just on one side and have good results. I've tried it. It doesn't work worth a darn. So eyeballing that, looks like we've gone a little bit past the edge of the die, which is what we want. I want to make sure that it's adequately covered. This is almost too dry on this side. See how this is here? I'm going to add just a little bit more liquid metal because it's almost too dry to work. Here again, doesn't run, doesn't puddle, but you do want both halves to be wet. Very wet, can't have any bare spots or anything. That should work great. All right, so two things we're going to do. We're going to glue the IHS on with a drop of super glue on each side, and we're also going to apply this silicone very lightly around the edge, except where we apply the super glue. We're going to use this Loctite Super Glue Ultimate Control Gel. And on the two sides where the ILM latches down, we're going to put just a small drop of super glue on each side. That's all we need. Don't need it in four corners, just one on each side to keep it from sliding around. So we're going to take this spatula. We're going to take just a tiny bit of this. You don't want very much at all because it'll cause contact problems. And you'll see after it's clamped together that just this tiny amount of silicone that we're putting on here is going to actually squish out a little bit. So if you put more than this, you can imagine how much would be squishing out. Just very little. It gets kind of hard to hold on to when you don't have any place to grab. And there we have it. Alright, so our dot should be on this corner because of those two notches. Let's have a look. Yes, it is. So there's pin 1, my dot's on this corner right here. I just set that in place. That's got it all perfectly aligned. Just snug those up. Tighten that down. It doesn't have to be super tight. And you can actually see well, that tiny bit of silicone that we put in there is actually squishing out around the edge there just a little bit, which is what we want, just so that it's sealed off. It's actually, you can actually leave it loose if you want to. You don't have to glue it down. But if you're putting it in a vertical mounted socket on a desktop or something like that, and you don't have the thing laying flat, it can be helpful to have it stuck in place. Now I can see through the clear acrylic here that the black silicone is squished out a little bit on that side too, that's covered up. So all the way around the edges we can see just the faintest amount of evidence of the silicone pressing out, which is what we want. So we're going to let this sit like a half an hour while they clean up this mess, and then we are done. This CPU is ready to rock and roll. There we go.